So this is not going to be your normal battle Lepanto discussion. I hope not. I don't think... most of them I've seen have concentrated more on the battle. And this one is about the alliances of command, because the thing is, the Battle of Lepanto might be in the running for the most complicated command structure and organization structure ever conceived of to operate at sea, and possibly the most complicated command structure to ever actually succeed in its operations at sea. And that is scary. And that is scary. And I'd like to point out that I have done God knows how many of these videos now, and I still have not got an Iron Brew sponsorship. And I do not know how. He says as he drinks his Iron Brew. All I'm asking for is some free cans to be sent my way. It would just be nice. And that there is a reason I'm doing this sort of sponsorship plug at the beginning, because a lot of this alliance is held together by patronage, sponsorship, and interwoven familial ties, let alone financial ties. And some of it is quite shameless. It's, okay, we'll support you as long as your bankers bankroll us to do X, Y, or Z. And so, yeah, it's the command structure is literally as shameless as that was just a second ago with the Iron Brew. That is what we're talking about, especially on the Holy League side. On the other side, on the Ottoman side, it's equally interesting. People have this idea the Ottoman Empire is this megalithic force. It's not. It's a whole series of alliances and structures and things which work together, and it's always an interesting one to get into. But realistically, we've got to talk about the wars which lead us to the Battle of Lepanto. And please note, I'm saying wars. Technically, it's the Spanish-Ottoman Wars, which between 1492 and 1792, it's actually easier to pick the years when they're not at war than it's a far shorter list than the years they are at war. And the Ottoman-Habsburg Wars from 1526 to 1791 are pretty much the same. So we have roughly 300 years, roughly 270 something years. Oh, so 260 something actually. I think it is 265 maybe? 265, yeah, probably. And then we have the Ottoman-Venetian Wars, which are equally long. Specifically, this is part of the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War. They do actually have more gaps between them. And there are lots of little wars which you can add in. You can add in the ongoing war between the Knights of St. John and the Knights, or the Knights Hospital, or Knights of Malta, and the Ottomans. And basically, it's one of those eras where peace is what happens when everyone's busily rearming because they've already got through the sharp pointy sticks, and they now want to actually... They now have got down to the point at which they're just literally chucking rocks at each other. And they know chucking rocks ain't going to work. Not the ranges they want to engage at. And you could argue these wars are about many different things. You could argue it's the cultural, economic expansion of the era of both sets of powers. You could argue it's the Ottoman need for empire and growing empire and conquest to feed their nation. One of the reasons why the Ottoman Empire ends up in a long decline, and one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire ends up in the issues it does, is because it never really completes a successful transition from a conquering, growing empire to a mature management empire, if that makes sense. It has structures which are focused around expansion, which are good while it's in its expansion phase and are really effective. But those structures, once it gets into its management phase, are less effective because they actually mitigate against good centralized government in some regards. This was the period where the Ottomans were still trying to expand. And they are very much trying to expand. Not as much as Suleiman the Magnificent had achieved. No. He's something special. But certainly the ones who came after him do continue to try. They continue to try. But Lepanto is this battle where, realistically, and I would argue it's realistically more than even necessarily the gates of Warsaw and various other parts of the world where the Ottomans were stopped, where this stops them managing to achieve their economic control of the Mediterranean. You see, if Lepanto doesn't succeed, the successes which come after would have come after a successful Lepanto for the Ottomans could have been Venice itself. It could have been various parts of, I would say, Italy would have probably been ultimately their aim, because if they can control Italy, they can control the trade flows for the entire eastern Mediterranean, and that in this period would have made them incredibly wealthy. They would therefore control not just a huge section of the land east-west routes, they would have controlled a huge amount of the onward movement of those goods. And that makes you very, very rich. So please, whilst religion is a big part of this, in that it's used by a lot to cover things and provide a coalescing force to put together and a reason for their disputes, ultimately this battle, as are most wars, is about control, resources, are about money. That's it. It's about money. Control of trade routes, control of natural resources, these things are critical to nations. And these wars, all of these wars, are about who controls them. Who controls the access. It's one of the interesting things is that people have often not drawn the correct parallels, I think, because why do the Europeans start exploring the other side of the Atlantic? Why do they go to South America, North America, etc.? It's because they can't go east, so they have to go west. They can't go east because the Ottoman Empire's there. And the bits that are actually worthwhile going east in at that time. They just don't want to deal with it. There's also the Rus Empire and various other things at various points around that, so they don't want to go east. But there are pressures coming from the Ottoman Empire, there are pressures coming from, which makes going west more attractive. Because if you can go west, if you can secure finances, if you can secure other ways round the world, even, to get to those sources of spice trade, to get to those that east-west trade between Europe and, to be honest, China, but also India to an extent. There's a fairly strong trade route going on. Well, you can bypass the Ottomans. And this is the other problem for the Ottomans, is that they are, in some ways, they are too militarily successful, because they mean that they can pretty much charge what they want to charge. And that raises prices enough in taxes when they're charging it to make things like voyaging round Africa to the Indian Ocean and on to China and Japan economically viable. All that comes back to Lepanto. All that comes back to Lepanto. One of the other interesting things you have here is that there are going to be names I'm going to be discussing in this battle who normally would be fleet commanders of their national fleets. And yet here they are squadron commanders. The people who are, it's kind of like you take the best admirals from World War II, from the US Navy, the Royal Navy, all the Allied navies. and you stick them in one task force together, and you have things like Rear Admiral Philip Vian or Vice Admiral Philip Vian, as later on a full Admiral Philip Vian, but him as now just a divisional commander of 4 destroyers. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the command structure in the Navy of the Holy League. So there is a really interesting thing in this battle in that, to an extent, the command structure should favour the Ottomans. It really should. The ship numbers, the capabilities, it should favour them. And at the same time, the leadership quality on the Holy League is either going to work together effectively and well and produce results, or it is going to destroy itself in a mass of recriminations and arguments over who made the wrong decision. We'll be getting onto that in a bit, but because let's consider the Holy League and its members. You have the Papal States. Lovely. This was when the papacy actually had large amounts of territory in Italy they controlled, and actually did have, under Pius V, some sort of military capabilities. Not much, but some. Then you have the Spanish Empire, Philip II, which included Naples and Sicily. Always worthwhile bringing them along. The Republic of Venice. The Republic of Genoa. The Knights of Malta, aka the Knights of St. John. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany and the Order of St. Stephen under Cosimo de' Medici. Okay. The Duchy of Savoy under Emmanuel Filbert. The Duchy of Urbino under Garibaldo as a second della Rovere. The Duchy of Parma under Ottavio Farnese. Sorry. There are a lot of very powerful personalities in here. It is not surprising that the person chosen to command the forces is chosen because he's the illegitimate half-brother of Philip II of Spain. Because he's got a close enough relationship to Philip that Philip trusts him, but a distant enough relationship that he's not a threat to him. i.e., he can't take his position. It's also worth noting that they didn't just put together a naval force. They put together an army. And the requirement was they would put together this army of 50,000 infantry, 4,500 cavalry, plus adequate artillery, ready by the 1st April each year the alliance was held. They also offered for the Holy Roman Empire, France and Portugal to join, but they decided they didn't want to. At this point, the Holy Roman Empire had a truce with the Ottomans. France was in active anti-Spanish alliance with the Ottomans because the French kind of like their alliance with the Scots. Whoever's my enemy's enemy, my enemy's enemy is my bosom pal. And it works. And Portugal was carrying its own war in Morocco and attacking the Ottomans in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean and doing other things over there. So they weren't members of the Holy League, but they were doing their part in distracting large amounts of Ottoman forces, because if you consider, look at the forces which are involved in the campaign of Lepanto versus the forces which are actually being deployed to defend places from potential Portuguese attack, that's a lot of force being taken away. A lot of force being taken away. A lot of money and logistics being taken away. And well, yes. Unfortunately, and I will say this unfortunately, or fortunately rather for the Ottoman Empire perhaps, when Pius V died in May 1572, the League started to unravel, and by 1573 it had fallen apart. And is officially disbanded. March 7th, 1573. With the conclusion of the War of Cyprus. There are so many wars going on at this point. Technically, the War of Cyprus is also known as the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War. And it results in Cyprus being captured by the Ottomans. This is despite the victory of the Battle of Lepanto. The actual forces that could have retaken Cyprus from the Ottomans, that land army, were never deployed. Because this is unstable, believe it or not. And it only works as long as you have a very, very good politician in the middle of it. And I would say, and this is me being charitable, Pius V is not a very good politician. He's capable at certain points. He is capable at certain points. He's very bad at handling Protestants. But he had still, despite not being that good at politics, he had managed to get elected, and he was good when it came to Catholic politics, especially when you're dealing with people who were very, very pious, or could be persuaded of that. And that meant he often had influence with Philip II. And when you're toting around the Spanish Empire, to an extent in your pocket, because they're kings in your pocket, you have a lot of pull. And when you're persuaded of things, well, the Republic of Venice managed to get someone to fight their battles for them. Unfortunately, it fails, but it's a good try. It's a really good try. With that being said, let's consider the Ottoman Empire in this period. The Ottoman Empire was, at this point in its period, it was both at its largest extent and its largest potential extent. It hadn't yet started a downward swing in sort of scope and size. It was very vibrant. It had potentials there. There were issues with its internal structure. There certainly were, but it's no worse than other nations at the time, realistically. What they had as a problem, though, was sea power. You see, the Ottomans go through swings and roundabouts when it comes to sea power. At certain points, they invest in it heavily themselves, and they grow some very interesting capabilities. At other points, they don't. At other points, they rely on the various bays and regents of allied sort of powers, such as Algiers, etc., to provide them with a fleet. And this means that they can end up with a very good fleet. It means also they can end up with a very bad fleet. They can have a fleet which is full of excellent ships and excellent crews. They can have a fleet which is bargain basement extravaganza, though, also. They're never quite sure what they're getting. And I would say that's often because if you consider the sultans, they might go with the army. They do tend to wander with the army. It's very rare, unless they are moving between places, that they are actually part of a naval battle or part of the fleet that's going to places, especially after Suleiman the Magnificent. Please note the word I used there was rare. Not never. I know there's going to be someone who's going to go, but this one, I'm not going to go, yes. And they're going to go, well, you said never. No, I said rare. And they do the best they can. They do the best they can, but they have limitations. They have limitations. And I think, realistically, their limitation is this. Whilst they need a large navy, because look at all that coastal region they have to support and protect, they also, rather desperately, need an even larger army. Because look at all that land border, those land borders they have to protect. Look at them all. They're humongous. And so the Ottoman Empire is still trying to work on expand. They'd like to go bigger. They'd like to get further, and if they could have kept on expanding, they would have done. I think myself, parts of Italy certainly are the next phase. If you consider how they are developing along, working up the rivers to various places, that always makes sense, because rivers are a good logistics line. Just again, what they did historically. But yeah, you need to start investing in something. And also I would argue, if you consider naval power, if they can get control of Italy, they can shut down their freight access. So if you think about it, if you can control Italy, or sections of Italy, you can shut down your freight access to basically Malta and the Straits of Malta. And as long as you can have a fleet there, you can protect all the rest of your coastline. Because who else is they're going to be? Who in that region is going to want to come and fight you if no reinforcement can come from the Western Mediterranean? Who's got a large enough fleet to come and fight you solo if there is no support coming from the Western Mediterranean? Realistically, that is a long-term Ottoman goal, because that secures themselves. It's like when talking about other countries today, we're going, well, they're looking at certain geographical positions, because if they can reach them, then they can secure this area with minimal effort. Well, that's the same with the Ottomans. You want to cut down on your size of fleet and what you have to maintain and all these things, you need something in Italy. So I think that's always part of the long-term aim for them. I really do. With that being said, let's look at the Holy League forces. So this is where I get to have some fun, because when you read off the stacks, you go, 212 ships. That sounds like such a useful force structure. Then you realise where all these ships come from. And when I say where all these ships come from, oh my, is that a mixture. That is certainly a mixture. We have the Spanish Empire, Naples, Sicily and Sardinia, so you have ships from all of those as part of the 49 galleys of the Spanish Empire. So, whilst there you go, Spanish Empire, 49 galleys of us have arrived. Yeah. Some of them do not speak the same language as the others. And some of them have very different command structures than the others, and ownership structures than the others, because there are private ships involved. Once you start doing the maths of that, that gets really interesting, because you're going, well, hang on, we have 115 vessels from the Venetian Republic. Yet Venice doesn't provide the commander of the forces. We have 50 galleys of the Spanish Empire, well, 49, let's be honest. 27 galleys of the Genoese Republic. 7 galleys of the Papal States. 5 galleys of the Order of St. Stephen. 3 galleys of the Duchy of Tuscany. So Tuscany has the Order of St. Stephen, which sends out 5 galleys, but 3 galleys come from the Duchy of Tuscany itself. So it's 8 galleys from Tuscany, but they're 2 different command structures. Then we have the 3 galleys of Duchy of Savoy. Okay, and 3 galleys from the Knights of Malta. You start going through these things and you start going, Well, let's be honest, in assigned ships, we have 48 plus 49 plus 115. So, let's see, 48 plus 49, that's got to be 97. That's got to be 97. And with a 97 onto 115, that's got to be 212. But we also know there's some private ships there. We know there are some private ships there. So what's the answer to this? Well, 1, we have a rough estimate of the number of ships there. 2, some of the ships which are claimed as being ships of these nations are hired ships. It's not just the Elizabethan Navy, Elizabethan Royal Navy, which is made up mostly of privateers hired from powerful and rich noblemen and rich merchant families. So yeah, there is a mixture going on here, and there is a mixture of many different command structures to get all these ships together. And think about this from the point of view of standardization. One of the things I love is the pictures which come out. Some of the paintings. They make all these ships look like they are so similar. They're not. They're different sizes, different shapes, different forms. Coordinating them is a nightmare because standardization doesn't exist. Not across this force. Not across this force structure. It's just not. It just can't. It really can't. And so, despite the largest, and the nation here, Venice, supplying the largest number of ships, and therefore having an outsized vote in what the fleet does, they don't have control of the fleet because of the command structure above it. Because whilst Venice is supplying 115 ships, the rest, they're not Venetian. And they are mainly allies and friends of the Habsburg and Spanish royal families. And their alliances. And their realities. Which means that for them, despite them providing less ships than the Venetians, they don't want to serve under a Venetian commander. And for Venice, well, if you consider what the Ottomans bring to the battle, and that is roughly 278 ships, 222 galleys and 56 galiots, they can't afford to confront that force solo. If they confront that force solo, they are outnumbered more than 2 to 1. This is the situation you have. And drawing all these forces together, well, how many nations are sending all the ships they have available? I can tell you that the Knights of John certainly aren't, i.e. Knights of Malta. They certainly have more than 3 galleys available. But they're not sending all their force. Why? Because if they send all their force and it gets lost, they get wrecked. The only one who's sending all the force they can to this battle are the Venetians, because they have to. Because if they don't, they're in real trouble. For everyone else, it's about sending enough so that they look good. And look like they're involved. But realistically, they could have sent more. The Spanish certainly could have. The Genoese, again. The Papal States, potentially. Order of St. Stephen, I'd say they could probably have rustled up an extra 2 or 3. If they'd really wanted to. But what they want to do is send enough force that they've committed everything they're supposed to commit, but not leave themselves so that they are completely bereft of forces for any other taskings they wish to do for themselves. And so this is the Holy League. It's a nice mixture, isn't it? It's a very nice mixture. Shameless book plug time. Now, this is a bit of a random topic. Not really. It's an anniversary today. It is the anniversary of the Battle of Lepanto, so it makes sense to do it as Battle of Lepanto. And from a leadership perspective, it does make a lot of sense. Now, I've hopefully spent the last 30 minutes trying to explain the entire task which is facing them. And if you're liking this, please do like, share and subscribe, because it really does help the channel grow. And shameless book plug, because there are more coming, but this is the one which is currently out. The thing is, what always interests me about this period is that nations do manage to work together. States do work together. People do work together. Who were fighting not that long ago, and now they put that aside because they had their new orders are to fight alongside each other and go and do their job. And they do go and do their job. And I like it. There's a level of professionalism which I find refreshing compared to some of the things we deal with today. There's a, yeah, we don't like you. Next year, we might be killing you. But at this moment, they're our enemy, you're our ally, we're on the same side, so let's go wreck them. And I like that. I like the ability to do that. Let's consider the leadership of the Holy League at Lepanto. And by the way, I do apologise. I can only find pictures of 8 out of 9 of the people involved. Now here is the fun thing once we get this command structure in front of us. Who's actually in charge? Is it John of Austria? The guy at the top there, who is the illegitimate half-brother of Philip II of Spain. He's officially his own in charge. Next to him is Álvaro de Bazan, who is otherwise known as Marquis de Santa Cruz. The guy who sets up the plans for the Armada and various other things. The guy who is basically Philip II's designated, oh, I need a naval job done. Call in my heavy hitter. He disagrees with me. I will have to listen to him because he's actually good at his job. Everyone else Philip II can chuck away, but him they can't. Then we have Luis de Requesens and Carlo de Argano Tagliavia. All very senior officers. In fact, down here we have Marcantonio Colonna, who is theoretically, and I will say this, theoretically, and I want to get this correct, is the Captain General of the Allied fleet. And actually during the battle does actually save John of Austria's life when he, well, counterboards his flagship when it's being overrun. But we also have from Naples, Diego de Mandrano, who we have no picture of. From Venice, we have Sebastiano of Venier and Agostino Barbaroggio. Oh, sorry. Barbaroggio. Got it right that time. And they are two very senior, very experienced officers. They really frigging know what they're doing. They really do. And at this point, and I will say this, at this point, he is on his track to becoming the Doge of Venice. And he will eventually become ambassador to France and various other things. He's a very, very... The Barbaroggio is a very, very influential family. Very influential family. And then we have, from the Republic of Genoa, we have D'Andrea Doria. Well, the fact is that so many of these names turn up later as names of Italian warships should tell you how important they are. They are. They matter. And all of these personalities are together leading groups. And this is not the entire command structure. Because I should probably have various members from the Knights of St. John and the various other holy orders, etc., that are there. Plus, then there's all the people who have brought individual ships, which they own, which are there, and it's, the whole thing gets on into endless numbers of who's in charge of what and what they're doing, what are their relationships. And realistically, John of Austria is in charge because he is a big enough name to be in charge, has enough status and connection to be in charge. And also, if it fails on him. He's a big enough name to take the failure, to take the blame. You know, that's an interesting thing when you start thinking about that in command structures. Why, one of the reasons why the Royal Navy doesn't get to deploy a Vice Admiral in the Falklands War as it was planning on doing. It actually has one called Derek Raffel sitting to one side to deploy down there to be the task force commander, is because it's felt if you deploy a Vice Admiral and you lose, you're going to look bad. So we'll keep the task force commanders back in the UK. No one will take any notice of them being back in the UK, of the Admiral running it from Northolt, and the task group commanders will be the ones who'll take the blame if it falls apart. And that causes all sorts of troubles down south with people not sure who's in charge of what and what's going on, and not having a proper command structure down there. Well, you have a proper command structure, but good luck getting it to work like a proper command structure here. Because realistically, if you don't keep these two men on side, you're in trouble. You haven't got enough ships to fight them. You know, whilst they haven't got enough ships to fight the Ottomans alone, if they go, you're all massacred. So you can have all the lofty titles you want. All the lofty titles you want. Realistically, though, also, when you start looking at the various people in charge and what's in charge of what force and what they're doing, you start realizing, well, they have to work this out, don't they? You know? They have to think about it. One of the interesting positions in this battle is, of course, Commander of the Reserves. Who's going to be put in charge of which formation, where they're going to be positioned. And that really does matter in the battle. It really does matter. Alvaro de Bazan, aka Santa Cruz, is in charge of the Centre Reserve. And without his commitment at the critical time, you'd have had real trouble. There's also the fact there's the Galeazes, which are supplied by Venice. Now, the Galeazes are critical ships. They're the ones which have the cannon on them. They're the ones which can make up in firepower what you lack in force, but also they can allow you to shape the battle. Now, recently, I did a video, which has come out on this channel, about another battle which takes place in a very similar place. A very, very similar place. Believe it or not, the Battle of Actium takes place just up the coast from where the Battle of Lepanto took place. Just up the coast. Not that far away at all. In fact, it's disturbingly close once you realise when you actually look into it. And you start to wonder, well, hang on, what's going on here? Well, this is a very good position in Greece to launch across to Italy, to launch up the Adriatic, to be able to dominate the areas. If we go back to the map which was discussed earlier of the Ottoman Empire, we're talking about, in Greece, about level of my finger. It's a very good position to gather your forces, and so that's where the Ottomans have gathered their forces. And this is where this force turns up. But why am I bringing this up? Well, because you're going to end up with a fight to the end. You're going to end up with a fight where neither side can realistically maneuver away easily. They have to fight. And if they have to fight, that makes leadership all that much more important. It really does. It's one of those weird things when we're talking about it. Leadership becomes even more important when your forces don't have room to maneuver. And one of the advantages with having such a top-heavy leadership structure of so many experienced and powerful individuals is that you're able to rely on it to keep your forces working towards the fight. In contrast, the Ottomans haven't realistically brought together their full might of either leadership or ships. They could have actually brought more together. And realistically, the Ottoman leadership at Lepanto comes down to 4 individuals in senior positions. In contrast, the Ottoman leadership, well, how do I put this politely? Seems more simple, seems more straightforward, but really isn't. It really is not. You see, the Ottoman leaders, and they're good men, they are good leaders for their time, for what they were chosen for, are also powerful political leaders, because that's how the Ottomans run things. Their military leaders are often their political leaders. See what I mean? That explains what I mean about earlier about the issues with expansion. It makes sense to have your senior officer be your senior military leader, also have your title as your senior vizier, your senior prime minister, when you're concentrating on expanding and you're going to be running your empire from the front. When you're trying to centralize and organize to run many fronts, you want to try and separate the two quite dramatically. Because you need one to be a bureaucrat whose tendency is to stay in one place and do the administration, the boring stuff that gets logistics sorted out, and you have another one who basically has to be prepared to constantly be running backwards and forwards from different sides, different places, to run the battles when you need them to run the battles. But if we consider the two, we have Muzid Ali Pasha, who has also a few other names. It could be Sofu Ali Pasha, or Sufi Ali Pasha, or Mezungulu Ali Pasha. He dies in this battle. He dies in this battle. And he was a statesman, a naval officer. He was the Grand Admiral, the Capudan Pasha, at the Battle of Lepanto. And he had also served as governor of Egypt from 1563 to 1566. He has a lot of experience. Putting him in charge is sensible. It's a standard thing. And again, to my mind, it does show how much of the Ottoman Empire is an inheritance of the Byzantine Empire, or rather the Roman Empire of the East. And its traditions, again, he's had the traditional sort of almost experience of going from civilian post to military post to civilian post, and sometimes we're having both at the same time. He was considered a very Sufic gentleman. He liked to use coarse woolen clothes and pay visits to the tombs of saints in the City of the Dead in Cairo and various other places because, he liked to show off his piety. This is some point that makes me worry about people when they are, how do I put this? Politics has always been the same. When someone is making a big thing of something and they're a politician, it makes me question it more than it makes me believe in it, for their view of supporting it. And someone who goes as quite as pious as he does, when he's in positions he is, becomes an issue. There's also Muhammad Sirocco, or Suluk Muhammad Pasha, sometimes known as Mehmed Sirocco. And he is also killed in action. And we have no picture of him. He was admiral of the. He had been the bey, that's the governor of Alexandria, and various other things, and commander of the Ottoman right at the Battle of Lepanto. Probably was the most aggressive of the commanders as well. That's what we have from sources, and as far as we know, he's beheaded by Giovanni Conteneri, the Venetian. He seems to have quite a strong battle versus Barbarigio. The Venetians, he really does fight them hard on the right. But their galleases do prove very, very strong there. Now the thing is, that's not the only command structure going on, because we also have the ships which are from the Regency of Algiers, and we have Occhiali, who have been born Giovanni Dionigi, later became Uli Ali, and also known as Gilik Ali Pasha. He's an Italian privateer who would go on to serve as commander for the Regency of Algiers, and eventually as Grand Admiral, that's Captain Pasha, of the Ottoman fleet. Now, the fleets do have some differentials. The Ottomans have more ships, but they also depend far more on composite bowmen, whereas the Christian fleet, and I'm just going to say that for the Holy Alliance because it just makes sort of sense to call them the Christianish fleet, and it is Christianish because, trust me, some of the members are probably not Christian, but leave that on one side. It's like the command structure for the Ottomans includes people who are former Dominican friars. There is some very interesting people when you start to look at things like especially the fleets of the Knights Hospitaller, or the Knights of Malta, etc., and those things, that they have a far more of a pragmatic policy when it comes to their recruitment than necessarily certain popes would have been comfortable with. So when we start to look at their formations, the Christian fleet is formed up with, to the north, the left division is 53 galleys and 2 galleases, mainly Venetian, led primarily by Agostino Barbeggio, with Marco Quirini and Antonio de Canali in support. The centre division is 62 galleys and 2 galleases, under John of Austria himself in his galley the La Real. He had Marcantonio Colonna, the Duke of Taglioscosa, commanding the papal flagship, Sebastiano Venero commanding the Venetian flagship, and Paolo Giordano Orsini and Pietro Agostini, the Prior of Messina, commanding the flagship of the Knights of Malta. The centre division of 16 Spanish and Neapolitan galleys was organised into squadrons surrounding John's flagship, and that was commanded by 3 captains. They were led by Captain Diego de Mandrano in the Fortuna de Napoli, the Captain Martino de Caner commanding the Mendoza de Naples, and Captain Diego Lopez de Llanos was in charge of the Luna de España. Now, if you're thinking, Alex, you've only got 2/3 into the formation. This is already starting to sound complicated. Look, in that way, this is the reduced names. I started off with a longer list of names, and I reduced them down. Eventually, I went with what are the people that you can actually go and find out more details about if you're more interested in it, and literally I have limited it to the ones you can readily find on English online sources. Because that just makes it a little bit easier for people to go out and find out more. But you will find even more names if you go click on those sources, which I've mentioned, but there's very little information about. And there are some wonderful books on Lepanto. And I'm just going to grab one out here because this is one I used in this one, for this video. This one by Nick Fields. I don't agree with everything in it, but it is good. It is very, very good. It is massive. It's that thick. Look. 2 fingers. 2 fingers thick. But it is chock full of information. It is really worth it. It's got good maps in it as well, which is always useful. Including, I'm fairly certain, this map came from this, or a version of it did. And it's really been a useful thing to read and go through and use as a reference. Is it perfect? No, none of the sources on Lepanto are perfect. But it's a good starting place. And then we have the right division, which is 53 galleys and 2 galleases under the command of the Genoese officer, of course, Giovanni Andrea Doria, the great nephew of the Admiral Andrea Doria, of course, who I've already discussed, but these are the Dorias for whom ships are named for. And a reserve division of 38 galleys. They are stationed slightly to the west and slightly behind the main fleet, under the command of Alvaro de Bazan, of course, Marquis de Santa Cruz, he later is unknown. And he was in charge to reinforce wherever he felt necessary. Which means, pretty much, at a certain point, the battle belongs to him. And honestly, I can't argue that, because you are basically taking the most senior ranking professional naval officer, who is being a pure naval officer, and telling him, right, if this battle starts to go bad, deploy. If this battle starts to go good, deploy. You know, we trust you. In contrast, the Ottoman fleet, which has no galleases, and the galleases are the big vessels in front you mostly see in front, but there's a couple sitting behind, and they are far bigger vessels. They're basically a galley with a galleon on top almost. And, well, the Ottoman formation, that was 57 galleys and 2 galleots on the right under Mehem Sirocco. 61 galleys and 32 galleots in the centre under Ali Pasha, and the idea was to use the galleots to be fast in the battle and overwhelm the numbers by numbers using them. And Ali Pasha was, of course, aboard the Sultana, and 63 galleys and 30 galleots in the south under Uruk Ali, aka Okiali. And there's another reserve of 8 galleys, 22 galleots, and 64 fustas, which are under the command probably of Caracossa, but we're not 100% sure. We know he was commanding a reserve, but his reserve might have been part of Ochiali's force. It might have been the reserve force. There is a whole debate about that, about where he is, what he's doing. We know he's there. We know he's in charge of something. We know he's in charge of a reserve. We don't know where that reserve is. And so this is the force you have. You have all this different you have these structures, they're deploying out. And realistically, the fleets are quite strong, they're quite capable, but also quite evenly matched. You see, the Ottoman fleet has technically more vessels, but the Holy League, the Christian fleet, has more firepower. And this is how they're matching in. And it's going to be a deployment of who can deploy the firepower right to match against the numbers. And that's the question they have for the battle. Now, this is one of those battles which really does degenerate into ship-on-ship actions rather quickly. Most galley battles do. They're not really a line of action battles. They're more engage and charge and fight and board, and generally beat the out of each other battles, but this is what happens. Now, when they're first approaching each other, there's actually a problem at one point. The Ottomans have the wind, and that's one of the reasons why they achieved this line-out. And it's only when the wind shifts at just before noon, about 11:30 hours, that they actually have the advantage come in on the wind that allows the Holy League to actually maneuver itself into this line formation. But even then, you'll notice that there's one line which is part of the line which is really not in position and really not organised properly. And also, it means that the landward side forces, Baggio, are not able to get close enough. The Venetians are not able to get close enough to land. So Sirocco actually manages to get round. He manages to get between them and a land. And that's why the battle between those two forces turns into almost one massive line of battle. Decisive advantage in that, though, part of the battle comes from something which I'm always bringing up. The galley slaves on the Ottoman ships have a nasty habit of, when the Christian troops, or rather the people who are fighting the Ottomans, liberate them, they take up arms and fight onside them. So whilst theoretically, when we're talking about the battle forces, we'd be saying, well, the Ottomans bring 37,000 sailors and oarsmen. The Holy League brings 30,000 sailors and oarsmen. The reality is, quite a large number of those oarsmen for the Ottomans end up joining the other side. This is why you do not use slaves as your engine propulsion for warships. It is not sensible. It might be cheap, it might be an easy way to get large numbers, but it doesn't help you. Criminals, maybe you can get away with if they think they have a chance of surviving, going back to their life and having some quality of life afterwards. You do not want to use slaves, because when someone comes over the top and is killing you, the slaves will go, well, we have a choice between them or them. If we fight on side of them, they'll let us go. If we fight on side of you, you'll just keep us back in chains. Give me my freedom and a spear! That's quite literally what happens quite a lot in this battle. It's quite a nasty battle. And it carries on. You keep having these battles where the flagships engage each other and they get into really nasty fights. At one point, John of Austria is almost killed, and if it hadn't been for another of the flagships coming up, if it hadn't been for Colonna coming alongside, smashing his bow of his galley into the Real, and then forcing the Janissaries off the ship and sweeping onto the Turkish flagship itself, sweeping onto that flagship and killing all aboard it, including Ali Pasha, killing all of them. I do love how different sources, and I've copied sections of books, switch between Ottomans and Turks. But the reason they're doing that is because they want to differentiate between the Ottoman ships, which are just purely Ottoman ships, and the Algerian ships. So they're basically calling them Turkish and Algerian. And they're all Ottoman. And I understand why they're doing that in the books, but it still does sometimes even confuse me. I'm something yeah. But it's kind of, how do you differentiate which are the Ottoman ships and which are the Algerian Ottoman ships, which are under the Ottoman flag but are Algerian? And yeah, I can understand using Turkish as the same for it does make sense. And when we start looking at the troops which are boarding, etc., and personnel who are charging across, you've got Knights of St. Stephen fighting their way through. And one of the interesting things is the Holy Orders of Knights are absolute animals in this fight. They butcher their way through the enemy on many different occasions. But realistically, the big point of the fight happens at two moments. There's the first attack when the Ottomans are moving in, their ships moving in, and the Galeses basically start blasting them to pieces. They break up their line of attack. And that hurts them. When Sirocco is killed in the fight for Barbaraggio, that takes out the north as well. So that means the landward side forces start to collapse for the Ottomans. Again, the loss of Ali Pasha, he almost took out the Real. And if he had taken out John of Austria, it wouldn't have mattered as much. Because honestly, the guy coming up behind at that point would have taken over and would have kept the centre going, because he was already commanding the centre at that point. And that is Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz. Alvaro de Bazan. And they are doing a really good job, but realistically, John of Austria is just going, I'm going to fight you! Come here, Ali Pasha, I will go for you! And the Bazan's going, oh good, he's out the way. Right then, you do that, you manoeuvre there, you... And he's doing a very good job. It's a wonderful thing when a plan comes together of, oh good, the guy who is probably the most experienced and best officer we have here for fighting these kinds of battles is going to be the only one left in a position where he can actually coordinate things. It's rather useful when that happens, because he takes over the coordination. And there is even a debate about Colonna and the getting those troops to support the Real. from where Colonna was, he couldn't actually see what was happening on John Austria's ship. So the only way he could have been told is if someone who was further back spotted what was going on and sent message forward. And that seems to be what we're going. Now, how are they sending messages? That's always an interesting one. They are making various flag signals. They don't really have that good a communication. But they also do have little boats wandering around and passing signals along, sort of little boats rowing up and down. And they're useful. They're useful, and they're allowing them to coordinate things as best they can. And I do mean as best they can. But realistically, well, the battle was decided by that form of manoeuvre, that communication. It was an absolute beast of a battle, though. Losing the commanders in the centre and the north broke the Ottoman fleet. What's interesting to note is that the Algerian ships are mostly not affected, and it seems to be their own reserve, the Turkish reserve itself, the Ottoman, the ships, that are the reserve forces that are held back, that are Turkish Ottoman ships, i.e. they've come from the royal forces, rather than a regent's or a bey's, mostly, are held back. They don't seem to be committed when they need to be committed. And there could be reasons for this. There could be command structure reasons. There could be the fact that the commanders are getting killed off. There could also be, and this was one of the interesting things, is when the wind changes, okay, when the wind changes direction, so it's now coming from behind the Holy League, that's also going to blow the smoke in that direction. It's going to blow the smoke behind or through the Ottoman lines. That makes communication incredibly difficult for the Ottomans. Now, the cannon aren't firing as often as they would in a height of the Age of Sail battle. You know, we're not dealing with Trafalgar rates of fire here. But we are dealing with cannon which, when fired, produce a lot of smoke, and when you have the already detritus of battle, the muskets and things going off, that can make communications interesting, especially when you've got the wind basically pushing it back. And it was a constant fight. It really was a constant fight. The Janissaries actually ran out of ammunition in the end and started throwing oranges and even other pieces of fruit at their adversaries, which leads to sort of one of the weirdest sort of slapstick moments of people actually laughing in a battle as they got been hit by an orange. Again, it's the Christian, and I'm saying Christian for the rowers because most of them were actually Greek Orthodox Christian, not Catholic. Especially the Turkish Ottoman ships, they revolted. They mutinied and delivered them to the Holy League. You know, at the end of the battle, it is the Holy League has taken 117 galleys and 20 galiots. That's what they claim. And another 50 or so ships have been sunk and destroyed. The reality is probably a good half of those ships were taken mostly by their own galley slaves. Because the moment they were freed, they were not happy about having been a galley slave. Which is a surprise, because everyone would think you'd like the fresh air and exercise. And the sea views, but no, they didn't. Such a surprise. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. If you're talking about even organizations like the Romans and the Carthaginians, don't use slaves for warships. Because I know Ben-Hur has it in it, but it's not the way the Romans did it, because the Romans didn't want this happening to them. Anyone who thinks about it for 5 seconds will work out very quickly that having slaves as your engines on warships is not a good idea, because you have to feed them to keep them motivated and make them good engines, So they're going to run for you. They're going to be fit and healthy, therefore, and well fed, which means the moment they oppose you, you've got problems and they've got motivation to oppose you. On the Roman ships, they were always auxilia. They were basically auxilia. They were hired. They were doing their 25 years service. It worked. And even when they did use slaves, because at certain points they did buy slaves for using galleys, they then they basically said, right then, you will go, if you do this service, you will be freed. You are freemen. You are now being hired. You will lose your freedom if you don't complete a certain term of service on the galleys. Okay. Better than being a slave. As is often the case with these battles, the Ottomans suffered overwhelmingly different casualties to their Christian counterparts. And again, the reason is probably because there's the habit that when you win a ship, you chuck the crew over the side. You'd be surprised at how many people who serve on ships in this period do not know how to swim. I'm not saying it would necessarily help them, but if you think about it, the Ottomans lose roughly 190 ships. Let's be honest. Let's be nicer. Let's be more exact. 187. They still have roughly 100 left. There are plenty of vessels for you to swim to. If you can swim. A lot of them can't. And when you capture a ship, what you do is chuck the crew over the side. Because that's the best way to secure the ship. And they do this. But after all this was over, of course, Cyprus is still lost. Cyprus is still lost. The Holy League wins a battle, but then it falls apart. The Ottomans, 6 months later, have built a further 150 galleys, have built 8 of their own galleasses, and have also built a huge number of galiots and other vessels. Their 8 galleasses they built were some of the largest galleasses ever seen at that time. And when they have this fleet enabled, they use their forces to assert supremacy. Sultan Suleiman II's Grand Vizier, the Sokolu Mehmed Pasha at the time, actually boasts to the Venetian emissary sender Marcantonio Barbaro that the Christian victory at Lepanto, rather than causing lasting harm to the Ottoman Empire, had actually enabled the capture of Cyprus by allowing them to be better prepared. This phrasing, a wonderful quote you can actually find in Wheatcroft's book, which I have got somewhere around here, on the Battle of Lepanto. It's a good book. It is. It's better on the broader conflict. It's better on the broader conflict, but it's full of some very interesting quotes, and it's especially about Lepanto. I've got it somewhere around here. Need to go hunting for it in a second. You come to see how we bear our misfortune, but I would have you know the difference between your loss and ours. In wresting Cyprus from you, we deprived you of an arm. In defeating of our fleet, you have only shaved our beard. An arm when cut off cannot grow again, but a shorn beard will grow all the better for the razor. Yeah. The thing is, though, even with the renewed fleet, the Ottoman commander avoids engaging the Allied fleet, even with his larger ships, and actually spends most of his time sitting in Modon, in a lovely fortress place. And the unfortunate thing for the League is that the leaders basically start to fall apart. John of Austria has had a glorious victory. He doesn't want to risk having a glorious failure. And then, as I said, Pius V dies, and honestly, the things that hold the Holy League together start to make it fall apart. John of Austria actually spends 1573 attacking and taking Tunis. which the Ottomans then retake in 1574. Peace is declared, as said, between the Venetians and the Ottomans, and it just goes worse and worse and worse for both sides, realistically, as they don't want to do, they don't want to risk losing anything, so they don't take anything, so they both lose. With that being said, though, realistically, when the Allies did actually work together, they actually had a fighting chance against the Ottomans, because whilst the Ottomans have their issues, they do have a lot of infrastructure and industry to draw upon to build a fleet and maintain a fleet when they're wishing to invest in it. In contrast, the Allied powers again have quite a large force if they can draw on it together, and if they can work together. This operation showed they could work together, but it wasn't one for lasting success. So the Battle of Lepanto, as glorious as it is, doesn't really achieve much itself. It is a signal of what's coming, but it myself doesn't add much to it, because it doesn't provide the framework for a lasting alliance. And when I say lasting alliance, I mean a good decade or so. It needed to be something to bed itself in properly and actually have an effect. And it doesn't provide the basis for realistic future cooperation. But there is an interesting question to be had there, and I always finish my videos with a question. What if it did? What do you think happens if the Holy League manages to hold together for a decade or so? Does it push the Ottomans back even further? Does it create a status quo? What happens? I'm interested to hear. Very interested to hear what you think. And with that, what's coming up? Well, next week it's going to be the US Naval Academy, Annapolis. That'll be fun. But later this week it's going to be Falklands War, the strategy of the Argentine attack on a naval task force. Could it have worked if Belgrano wasn't sunk? I think I'm going to record that tomorrow. I think I'm going to take the rest of the day off and I'll record that tomorrow. I shouldn't do. I should be going absolutely non-stop on the recordings at the moment. I need every one I can do done, but it's a Saturday night. I feel like going and playing Pirates of the Caribbean on Twitch and chatting away with people in the Discord server, and what can I say? Sometimes it's fun to take an evening off, even when you really shouldn't. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you like, please do like, share and subscribe. That really does help the channel grow, and well, thank you for being here. Take care and have a nice evening. Or morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching it.